Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you might be. I notice there's a couple of people that are not in the UK. Welcome. So good day to wherever you are, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. Just to make sure that you're going to get what you're expecting, we're going to be looking at the 50,001 Energy Management Standard, and we're going to be looking at the transition, what we need to do for the transition, and it's 8 months to go, because more or less we are 8 months away from the end of the transition period. Just a quick word of warning. Normally my webinars tend to overrun. If you've sat through a webinar before, you'll know that I like to sort of go on a little bit. I've got to be somewhere else at 3 o'clock our time, so we've got exactly an hour. In fact, we've got 59 minutes left now. So I am going to press on pretty quickly. I appreciate there may be still a couple of people joining us, but we will push on. I'm going to skip through these early slides. I always say I'm contractually obliged to show these slides. This is just a little bit about NQA, who we are. You can read those at your leisure. It tells us a little bit about the type of things we do, the training courses we do, and that's a little bit about me. I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for ISO 14001 and 50001, so the Environment and Energy Principal Assessor, and I've been at NQA now for getting on for 14 years. So part of my role is doing this type of thing. You'll notice on the key info it says a 45-minute webinar. I don't think I've ever stuck to that. Importantly though, questions in the chat box. So you will see, hopefully you'll see on the right hand side of your screen, you should see a number of boxes. One of those says chat. If you have any questions as we go along, type them into the chat box and I'll try and answer them as best I can. We'll either answer them at the time, if I think it's appropriate, or what we might do is come to them at the end. And hopefully, if I get things moving, we'll have a bit of a chance for some question and answers right at the end of the session. The other thing to remind you, I think it was on that slide anyway, there's no need to frantically scribble down everything I'm doing. Everybody who's registered for the webinar, whether you're attending or not, obviously if you're not attending you won't hear this message, but everybody who's attending will get a copy of the slides and also get a link to the recording of this webinar. In fact, where that will be, all our webinars are there, whether it's this one, whether it's ones I've done on energy, environment, other webinars that people have done on other subjects, other topics as well. All our webinars are available, and it's on YouTube, so it'll be a YouTube link. So you don't need to write anything down, you don't need to frantically scribble, you don't need to worry about getting the slides. You'll get everything sent to you early next week. So what are we going to learn? The key concepts of 50,001, what it's all about, what the standard's all about. Look at a little bit of the new terminology, some of the new clauses in there, some of the requirements, the evidence that we as assessors might expect to see. Have a look at the transition timeline and some notable dates. As I've already alluded, it's 8 months to go. And towards the end, a little bit of some practical tips. Another quick word of caution, there are some slides towards the end that talk about continual improvement. If we run out of time, we'll skip through those. However, I am happy to take any questions. And if you have anything that you feel that we haven't adequately covered because of the time constraints this afternoon, feel free to email me, richard.walsh@nqa.com. And we can always run, if need be, a subsequent question and answer session if that's something that may interest you. So, all of these new standards, all the standards in this format, Annex SL it's called, Annex SL format, all of these standards have an intended outcome. And the intended outcome of 50,001 2018 is continual improvement in energy performance, fulfillment of compliance obligations, and the achievement of a business's set energy objectives. It also, as with all the other standards, takes into account now how change is managed. There's a much greater emphasis on the planning process, the management of risk. And because all of these standards now are in this Annex SL format, they are designed to be easily integrated with other standards, but also they are all expected now to be integrated within a business process or a company's business processes. That's just a little bit about where the standard came from, a little bit of history. The first energy management standards appeared probably 15, 16 years ago now. I started getting involved in this in 2009 with EN, or BS as it was, British Standard as well, 16001, and the first version of 50001, which is still current and will be current running alongside the new standard till January next year, is the 2011 standard. So key dates, where are we on this journey? As I said, the original standard was issued in 2011. In 2017, there was the new draft standard of this current version, and the initial date of launch, it was issued on the 21st of August 2018. Now, all of these standards initially were designed to have a 3-year transition period. So really, we should have been thinking not 8 months to go, but probably more like 3 months to go, because it would have expired on the 21st of August 2021. However, because of COVID, this standard, as well as 45001, have had the transition period extended, and for 50001, anybody who hasn't transitioned to the 2018 version of the standard, their certificates will automatically expire on the 31st of January 2022. So it's ended up being about a 3.5-year transition period. I know what you're going to say. Why do we keep changing all these standards? We just get to know one standard and suddenly it's been changed. I was in a conversation this morning where we were talking about maybe possible changes for 9001 in maybe different iterations of that standard. So standards are continually evolving. And they do that because they have to remain relevant. They have got to retain their relevance to industry and to other organisations using them. It's expected that this version of the standard is going to be around for possibly up to 10 years. So we might still be sat here talking about this standard in 2028. So it'll have been around for 10 years. And they evolve to try and reflect the increasingly complex environments in which organisations operate. We need to ensure that standards reflect the needs of all potential user groups. Some of the older standards, 9001 particularly, in the early days, some of the comments were that it worked well or it read well if you were a manufacturing organisation, but if you were a service industry, if you were providing a service rather than a product, then it didn't quite make sense, or it didn't appear to be quite as relevant. So the wording, the terminology, all is designed to reflect any sector that you may be in, not just necessarily a manufacturing sector. A much greater push in these new standards has been an increased focus on corporate governance. There's this whole section now on leadership. It's not just about senior management commitment, it's about leadership, it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Being a leader in an organisation is much more now than just signing the policy statement and maybe sitting in on the management review. You're expected to take the lead on, in this case, energy management, and ultimately a push from industry for easier integration. So all of these standards now follow this Annex SL format, as this has done, but as you'll notice at the bottom, there's a big but, and I'll explain why shortly, because it's not quite stuck to that format. If you're familiar with all the standards, which I'm sure you are by now, you'll recognise that those are the Annex SL clauses, and the bits we're interested in are clauses 4 to 10. Clauses 1, 2 and 3 are outside the auditable part of the standard, just to correct a misconception that one or two people have come up with a couple of times. Clause 1 scope does not refer to the scope of the energy management system that's been implemented. Clause 1 scope simply refers to the scope of ISO 50001 itself and what it's trying to achieve. So the bits we're interested in as a certification body are clauses 4 to 10, the 7 auditable clauses. As with all of these standards, it follows the Plan, Do, Check, Act, the Deming cycle. If you are have a background in quality management, Plan, Do, Check, Act. and that's really how the standard fits in there. I prefer to show it like this. This is quite interesting. This is a slide that I've been using for quite a while, and I've come across many other organizations that use this same slide. I can assure you, I haven't pinched it from somebody else, they've pinched it from me, but I don't mind really. I prefer to see things set out slightly in a linear fashion, but that's the Plan, Do, Check, Act with the main clauses and sub-clauses of the standard shown in there. As I've said, the whole idea is to easily integrate. So the idea being that they will all fit together, they all have a common thread. If you're interested in integrated management systems, a little bit of an advert, myself and Terry Fisher. Terry is our principal assessor for occupational health and safety. He and I are running a webinar on the 18th of June, looking specifically at integrated management systems and how they might best work, and some tips and techniques on fully integrating. That might be one, if it is an area that interests you, I can well recommend you sitting in on that webinar. So 18th of June. One of the questions I also get asked quite a bit is, how does it fit in with 14,001? I've got 14,001. Why do I need to do 50 as well? Is it not just replicating things? To an extent, yes. However, 50,001 focuses purely on energy performance improvement, whereas 14,001 addresses all the different significant environmental impacts in an organisation, one of which might be energy. And both standards obviously can be implemented individually, or they can be integrated with each other. And a lot of my clients do have a fully integrated 50 and 14 standard. However, if energy comes out to be an organisation's most significant impact, then looking at 50,001 might be an appropriate standard, because it does take energy management to a much higher level, and it gives it that higher focus within a business. It's not just lost within all of the other aspects and impacts that might include waste or resource usage. It gives it that sort of more significant profile. Couple of explanations for the terms and expressions used within the standard, and this is sort of across all of the standards. The standard now uses the term correction, which is action to eliminate a detected non-conformity. So you find something wrong and you do something about it straight away. That's defined as correction. Corrective action is now action to eliminate the cause of a detected non-conformity. We used to call that preventive action, but now that's been dropped from all of these standards as a specific clause. I still have clients that refer to it, and I still refer to it, but the standards don't use that terminology. It's correction and corrective action. And then the important one, energy performance. Measurable results related to energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption. The standard is all about improving energy performance, which doesn't necessarily mean using less energy. It means using the energy you're using in a much more efficient and effective manner. So the main body of this presentation is going to be going through the clauses of the standard, and we'll go through them in order. So if you are familiar with 9,001, 14,001, and indeed 45,001, then the clause on context won't be new to you, but this is new within the context of energy management. It's a new requirement, and as 50,001 has taken on this Annex SL format, it's had to have this clause, this section 4, looking at context and interested parties. So it's all about determining any issues, whether they be internal and external, that are relevant to what an organisation does and that can affect its ability to achieve the intended outcome of its energy management system. Now, moving slightly forward into clause 6, clause 6 asks us to think about risks and opportunities. And clause 6.1 uses the information you've come up with at this point. And the way I like to think about it is, when we're thinking about context, there are things out there that will help you achieve improvements in energy efficiency. There are things out there that will get in the way. So the things that will help you become the opportunities, and we need to maximize those. The things that are going to stop you achieving what you like to achieve, or maybe will hold you back, they're the risks, and they're the things that we need to look at mitigating. So it's all about determining the internal and the external issues relevant to what an organisation does and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcome, which is the improvement in energy performance. What's going to help? What's going to get in the way? If we think about it that way, it results in the energy management system focusing on the things that present the greatest risk. And all of these standards use the term risk, positive and negative. Positive risk is an opportunity, obviously negative risk is a risk. There's no set way of doing it. The standard doesn't say what you've got to do or how you have to do it, should I say. The standard says what you have to achieve. A lot of people look at it in this way, look at it in three areas: energy-related issues, external issues, and internal issues. Very, very similar to all of the other standards, legal, regulatory, economic, technological, social, cultural, etc., etc. Internally, what's the culture of the organisation? What capabilities have we got? What's our strategic direction? What other operations and systems have we got in place, etc., etc. And energy-related, greenhouse gas emissions, although the standard isn't a greenhouse gas standard, most businesses have some pressures on them now for greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is to reduce our energy usage. So that's why there's a little bit of a crossover. But this standard is not a carbon standard. It's purely looking at kilowatt hours of energy. So that's a little bit of a guidance as to how you might think about setting those that context out. As with the other standards, interested parties. All businesses have people who have an interest in what they do. They might be clients, they might be the neighbours, they might be suppliers. Could be Mrs. Smith across the road who has to hang a washing out on a morning. It could be anybody. Anybody who has a relevant requirement that's related to what it is that you as an organisation or one of your clients as an organisation has to comply with. This is the first part where the standard has really gone away from the Annex SL format. Those of you that are familiar with 14001 will be familiar with clause 6.1.3. So 6.1.3 is compliance obligations. This standard does not have a clause 6.1.3. This standard, for a start, doesn't use the term compliance obligations. This standard, a bit like 45,001 on health and safety, has retained the term legal requirements or legal and other requirements. But rather than setting it out separately under the planning phase, which is where 6.1.3 sits in 14,001, it's set it out under needs or expectations of interested parties. So it's basically saying that the regulator, anybody who might have an interest in what you're doing, and that might be a regulator, might be a local government, might be national government, could be anybody, but if they have an issue or a need from a legal perspective, it becomes an interested party, and you need to look at it then. Now, one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, if we have 14,001, do we have to run legislation in two separate ways? Do we have to do 14,001 in the way 14,001 requires and have a register of compliance obligations? And do we have to stick all our 50,001 stuff under interested parties? And the answer is no, you don't. As I've said, the standard tells you what you have to achieve, not how you have to achieve it. And if you are implementing 50,001 alongside 14 and you already have a workable way of managing legislation in 14,001, you can stick with that. There is no need to do it in this way, so long as somewhere in the system you have identified the needs of interested parties in terms of legislation. If you want to call it legislation, call it legislation. If you want to call it compliance obligations, call it compliance obligations. Now, just a quick reminder, I'm fairly conscious that nobody's asked any questions yet. That means you've either all nodded off or I'm explaining things in a way that you're quite happy with. So I'm not going to keep pushing for questions. I will occasionally remind you, but if you do have any questions as we go along, type them in the chat box. I'll see them pop up on my screen and we'll deal with them in an appropriate way. We've got a list there of who the interested parties might be. It's not an exhaustive list. And again, I'm sure we've all seen lists like this as part of management systems. And for energy, it's absolutely no different. Clause 4.3 within this first section of context looks at the scope of the energy management system, scope of the EnMS. Now, again, there's a number of unique requirements for 50,001 that don't tend to sit in some of the other standards. So you can set the scope as a whole or a part of the organisation. So I have a number of clients whereby there are just certain facilities within their organisation that they've chosen to certify to 50,001. So they haven't done the whole business. They've maybe taken 3 or 4 of their key manufacturing sites and just certified those. Within the scope of the system, you have to include all of the energy types used by the business. So for instance, you can't say, well, actually, we'll pick the sites that use gas and electricity, but we'll ignore the sites that use oil. So that the scope has to include, if you're not going to cover the whole of the organisation, you can't use the scope to exclude an energy type. This is the one, the next bullet point is the one that causes a little bit of an issue. Within the scope, you must have the authority to control energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption. When this standard was published, I had 1 or 2 clients contacted me and said, well, actually, one of our officers, we're in a fully managed office in an office block. We pay some rent to the landlord. We've no idea how much energy we use because it's fully inclusive. There's no sub-metering. All we can do is we can turn the air conditioning up and down and we can switch the lights off. Is that sufficient? And the answer is yes, it is. Because if you think about just switching the lights on and off and turning the air conditioning up and down, you're controlling energy efficiency. You can turn the aircon down a bit. Energy use and energy consumption, you can switch things on and off. So yes, it does apply. However, you have to have that authority within the scope. And as with the other standards, the scope and the boundaries have to be made available as to interested parties. And then the final bit, the management system itself, establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the energy management system to achieve the intended outcomes. That's a policy commitment. It should be worded in the policy. It's the same as 9,001, it's the same as 14,001. The system itself has to continually improve. We need to ensure that any processes we've got are controlled, carried out as planned, and achieve the desired results. The system should define how the different processes interact, but we need to think about how the energy management system fits in with our other business processes, design and development, procurement, human resources, sales, etc., etc. But when the system is being put together, a lot of it is based around what it is we're trying to control, and that comes back to what we thought about in clause 4.1 and 4.2, which is the context of the organisation, our risks, our opportunities, and the needs of interested parties, and in this case, the legislation that we might have to comply with. The clauses on leadership and commitment are basically the same as in the other Annex SL standards. So to make sure that the energy management system isn't managed in isolation or separately from the core strategy of the business, it needs to fit in there. I always like to think in a business with a fully integrated management system, no matter where you are in the business, whatever part of the business you're looking at, a bit like a stick of rock, if you take a slice through the middle, you would expect to see those strands of energy, environment, health and safety, quality running through the business. That's what this standard is also asking for, that however the business is managed, whatever business decisions are being taken, whatever level they're being taken at, some thought is given to energy performance and energy efficiency. So therefore, energy is considered when strategic business decisions are being made and the energy targets, the energy requirements are aligned with the wider business objectives. So it's no good saying we're going to halve our energy use, but at the same time double our output. You might be able to use that energy more efficiently if you're making, if you're using more of it, but you can't. The two can't be at odds with each other. The system has to benefit from an appropriate level of resources, receive the appropriate involvement from across the business, and promote continual improvement. So this is something that we're looking for the leaders within a business to be able to promote continual improvement, both in energy efficiency and in the system itself. And then ensure that energy performance indicators, that's what ENPI stands for, energy performance indicators, appropriately represent the energy performance of the organization. So top management is the person or group of people who directs and controls the organization at the highest level. Essentially, we're talking about board level. However, thinking back to the example I gave a few minutes ago, where I was talking about maybe a company or an organization implementing this at just maybe one site, top management would be the senior management of that business unit. However, the standard requires top management take accountability for the effectiveness of the management system. When I come into organizations to audit them and I sit down with leaders, sit down with chief executives, it's one of the things I ask them about. How do they manage? How do they take accountability? How do they demonstrate that they've got the finger on the pulse of the management system and that they are taking that accountability? And it's quite often an interesting conversation. So the policy, as with all of the other standards, this standard requires a policy to be written. It has to be appropriate to what the organisation does. You can't just copy somebody else's. Has to be a framework for setting and reviewing energy objectives. There has to be a commitment in there to ensure the availability of information and resources to achieve the objectives and targets. This is almost a tick list of phrases that need to be in an energy policy. The policy must commit to satisfy applicable legal requirements and other requirements. If you want to commit to meeting compliance obligations, which is the 14,001 terminology, that's fine. You don't have to use the term legal requirements. There has to be a commitment to continual improvement of the system and of energy performance. The policy has to support design and procurement for energy efficiency. That's a clause that was in the old standard and is a clause in the new standard as well. Designing and procuring items to enhance our energy efficiency. The policy has to be documented and available to interested parties and, of course, communicated within the organisation. Now, one of the key changes, the old standard, the old 50,001-2011 standard, had a requirement in there that a business had to have an energy manager. Now, the requirement for an energy manager in the new standard has been dropped, just in the same way that 9001 no longer formally requires the role of a quality manager. However, unique to this standard and none of the other standards, this standard formally requires that there is an energy management team. Now, I have had the question asked, can we have a team of one? In other words, can it still be the energy manager? And my answer was, technically yes. However, it would be frowned upon because the idea, the logic behind having a team is to try and bring together around the same table all of the people within a business who have both an interest and an input into how energy is used. So you might have an energy manager, you might have a maintenance manager, you might have the production manager, you might have some sort of planning officer in there. There might be a number of different people who all have a part to play in managing energy across the business, and there does need to be a formally constituted energy team. And the roles within that, as you can see there, the bullet points: ensuring that the system's established, implemented, maintained and continually improved, making sure the system conforms to the requirements of the standard. This phrase, continual improving energy performance, keeps cropping up time and time again, and you'll see that, and it's making sure that that's actions are being taken to make sure that happens. Reporting on the performance of the system and improvement back to top management. Remember, top management have the ultimate responsibility for ensuring that the system's working, but the team are the people who will probably do this in a sort of a hands-on basis. And then establishing criteria and methods needed to ensure the operation and control of the EnMS are effective. So in other words, the team probably also handles the audit function, non-conformances, and possibly also coordinates the activities around the management review. And then finally, there is a requirement to establish, implement, maintain, and improve the system, again, as I said, to make sure that the resources are provided. Now, I've moved this clause in the presentation because it's actually 7.1. But actually, if you think about any organisation, the resources tend to be provided by the senior management. So although resources sits as a clause in clause 7.1, I think resources also need to be brought out and brought in here to the attention of the senior management. So that's why I've moved it. Clause 6 is where we start to move off now slightly differently in a different direction somewhat from the other standards. We're now starting to get into the nitty-gritty of what an energy management system is asking us to measure. So the planning clauses are all about making sure that the system meets the intended outcomes, as we've got there: continual improvement, risks and opportunities, achieving energy objectives, preventing or reducing undesired effects. But ultimately, this whole section is about planning to make sure that as a business, our management system is achieving continual improvement. So the organisation needs to plan how it's going to identify its risks and opportunities. So we've thought about them in context in the clause 4.1. We've now got to think about what are we going to do with those risks and those opportunities. How are we going to mitigate the risks? How are we going to grab and maximise the opportunities that are put before us? So we need to think about how we're going to build all of these things in to the energy management system, and then make sure that we evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. So I always think, in a way, the standard now takes things in slightly the wrong order, because the next clause is about objectives, energy targets, and planning to achieve them. Now, we haven't at this point in the standard looked at where we're using energy. You think about 14,001. Objectives and targets is the next clause after you've identified what your significant aspects are. In a way, this is putting the cart before the horse and saying, think about your objectives at this point, but we don't know where we're using energy yet or how we're using energy. However, I'm going through the standard in the order that it's written. We don't have to attack the standard in a linear fashion. So it's a policy commitment, improvement of the EnMS and energy performance, and setting and achieving objectives is part of that. So objectives, and just interestingly, this is another slight diversion from how other standards work. 14,001 talks about objectives and planning to achieve them. This standard still uses the term target, objectives and targets. So objectives must be consistent with the policy. They must be measurable if practicable. It mentions SEUs. Now, SEUs don't come along till later on. SEU stands for significant energy use. It's the energy equivalent of a significant aspect. They need to be monitored, they need to be communicated, and they need to be updated. So those are the objectives. And for each objective, we need to plan action. Who's going to do what? When are they going to do it? What resources are we going to need to achieve that objective? How are we going to evaluate our progress and our ultimate achievement of the objective? And how are we going to integrate all of this into our wider business processes? Energy review is what actually gives us the information in order to set the objectives and targets. So the energy review is the 50,001 version of the aspects and impacts evaluation. So it's all about analysing where we use energy, how we use energy, where we use it, the different types of energy that we use, and how much we use. So whereas in environment, we're thinking about our impact on the environment and we're coming up with a scoring mechanism, that's how it's usually done, to carry out some sort of risk analysis on the risks of our different impacts on the environment. The energy review, it's purely a numbers game. It's how much energy do we use and where do we use it? And our significant energy uses then become the numbers of areas that we use, where we use a significant amount. Now that might sound a bit odd, but there is no guidance as to what is an SEU. An SEU is the the top number, and it's not a defined number, of areas where you're using a significant amount of energy. One of my clients decided to list out all of the different groupings of energy they use and then apply the 80-20 rule, and said we're going to draw a line along the list at 80% of our energy use, and daft as it might sound, it was about 20% of their pieces of equipment that used 80% of the energy. There's no key way in doing that. The standard doesn't offer any guidance. It's all about you deciding what you think are the significant uses of energy. Once you've decided what they are, you have to think of a number of things. So first of all, you have to determine what the key variables are for that significant energy use. How much energy do we use is going to depend on something. So if it's a production machine, the key variable will be how much work is being put through that process. If we're talking about heating or cooling, air conditioning or heating, the weather is going to be a key variable. So basically, we need to think about, for each SEU, what is it? What's the thing that actually affects how much energy this process or this energy use actually uses? We then determine its current performance. How is it currently performing? And then who controls or influences that energy use? Is it the operator? Is it somebody in the office? Is it somebody in planning? However, so who has the input into how that actually works? And coming out of all of that, it then asks us to determine and prioritize opportunities for improving energy performance, which takes us back to the objectives that were in the previous clause. Another requirement now is also to look forward and say, in the next period, in the next 12 months, in the next 6 months, whatever period you decide, where do we think our energy performance and energy consumption are going to be moving forward? So the standard requires that a review is conducted, it's updated at defined levels, just as you would update your significant aspects, and it should be updated in response to major changes in facilities, equipment, systems, or energy using processes. So there are a number of reasons why you might want to change or update the energy review. And it's one of the areas that have to be documented. The system has to maintain the methods and criteria used to develop the energy review. Some organizations just measure absolute energy usage. So they'll say this year we have used 350 megawatt hours of energy. Now that's an absolute measure and that's perfectly acceptable to use. However, bearing in mind that the standard is requiring a performance improvement, that's basically saying that next year you've got to use less than 350 megawatt hours. A better measure is to normalize that against something else. So you might say, how many kilowatt hours or megawatt hours of energy does it take to produce a unit of production? So a performance indicator is an amount of energy measured against something else, and it's usually the key variable. So for instance, if your most significant energy use is in heating or cooling, then you might measure that against the temperature, the outside temperature. If it's a production related thing, you might measure it against sales, you might measure it against some of the paper company or some of the printing companies I work with, they actually measure square meters of print. So they'll say, 1 square meter of print uses so many kilowatts of energy, and that becomes a performance indicator. So the performance indicators have to be set in a way that they can demonstrate energy performance improvements. The method for how they're determined and updated has to be maintained as documented information, as does the values themselves, and the values shall be reviewed and compared to a baseline figure. Now, that's the first time we've seen mention of the baseline figure. We haven't got to baseline figure yet. So again, I think the standard's a little bit back to front in some respects. Oh, there we go. Energy baseline. All improvements are judged against a baseline. So if you think about, if you switch the news on and we're talking about carbon footprinting and we're talking about progressing to net zero, we're always measuring against a baseline. They'll say our carbon footprint in the UK is this compared to where it was in whatever baseline year we set. The standard requires for energy performance, a baseline is set. And the baseline is using the information from the energy review and takes into account a suitable period of time. Now, the suitable period of time is nearly always 12 months. And the reason it's 12 months is it takes into account all of the variables. If you were to only take summer, then you might find you're struggling because you've got winter and you've got increased heating. If you just were to take winter and you've got air conditioning, you might find that that's a slightly different issue. If you've got, if you're in a business where production is heavier in the run up to Christmas or something like that, you might find again that taking a 3 or 4 month period as a baseline doesn't fit. So I think without exception, every business I've ever audited on 50,001 takes a baseline year. So as a guide, I would always say allow 1 full year as a data, but also allow a full year between the baseline and the current year, because we have to be able to demonstrate that an improvement has been made. So we're sat here now in May 2021. If your baseline was 2020, we haven't seen a full year since the baseline to judge on performance improvement. So I always say, sat here now in 2021, the latest year I would suggest that you had as a baseline was 2019, so we can then show a full 12 months improvement in 2020. Baseline should also be revised, and this is the bit that I always had difficulty with, because to me a baseline is a set point in time, but a baseline should be amended if the performance indicators no longer reflect performance improvement, energy performance, if things have changed, if there's been major changes to the static factors. Now, here's another term that we haven't come across. Every energy use has 2 things. It has a static factor and it has a key variable. The static factor, so let's take a machine on a shop floor that's producing components. The static factor is the machine. The machine's there every day, it doesn't alter. The key variable is the amount of work that's coming through. So if you change your static factors, so if you decide to upgrade your machinery, hopefully to something more energy efficient, you might need to come back and revisit your baseline. And then finally, to fit in with all of the other requirements of the standards now, all of these standards have become much more proactive. So we have to think about not just doing something, but planning to do it. So this is a new clause, new little clause that's been put in that says we have to think about how are we going to collect the data. Data collection doesn't come along until we get into clause 9. But at this stage, we need to think about what data are we going to collect and start to plan what equipment, what information we're going to need when we get to the data collection phase. Now, I am conscious that we've only got about 17 minutes left and there's still a couple of clauses to go through. So I'm going to skip through some of these because a lot of these areas haven't changed from the old standard. So the competency bit hasn't really changed. It's exactly the same as the other standards. We need to determine what competency people need to carry out the tasks we are asking them to do, and to make sure that they have that competence available to them, and to make sure that they are competent on the basis of education, training or experience. And if they fall short in what we expect of them, we need to take necessary action to allow staff to acquire that competency. Awareness is very similar. Anybody doing work under the organisation's control, including contractors, need to be aware of the energy policy and the commitments within it, how their work can impact on energy performance, how they can contribute to the effectiveness of the system, and also how the business will benefit from improving energy performance, and the implication or the risk of not conforming. Communication, internally and externally, there needs to be a process in place. The key bit in this is the 3rd bullet point, there is a requirement that there is a formal system in place to enable input and feedback on improvements to the energy management system and to energy performance. There needs to be a documented method whereby employees, contractors, anybody that's working with you can submit suggestions. It might be a box that people just fill a slip of paper in and drop it in, but there needs to be some formal constituted method whereby input and feedback on improvements can be gathered, and that is something that we formally look for when we're doing audits. Documented information, again, it's based very similar to the 2011 version. There needs to be documents retained. The focus is on the implementation of the system, not a complex document control system. It's not a quality system. We just need to make sure that the right document's in the right place. You need to make sure that you hold the documentation required by the standard. There's no formal requirement for a manual, but whatever documents you've got have to be controlled, available, and protected. This slide, people tell me, is one of the most useful slides that I've ever produced. The sad person that I am, I went through the standard, and everywhere that the standard said documented information must be retained, I've written it down on here. Now, the standard doesn't use the term documents and records. That's the terminology from the old standards. I've split them out like that because I think we understand better what documents and records are. So documents obviously are things that may provide information, give us guidance, detail how things happen. Records, as the name suggests, tend to record something that we might need to go back and refer to. So if you use that as a checklist, and if you can go through that and tick every box on there and say, my EnMS covers all of that, you won't be far wrong. Moving on into the doing clause, if you like, plan, do, check, act, operational planning and control. We need to make sure that all the processes that we've got that use energy are properly planned and controlled. So controlling the processes related to our now identified significant energy uses, establishing the criteria. So if it's, for instance, say an oven, a heat treatment oven in maybe an engineering type business, how's that controlled? What's the temperature set at? How do we control the temperature? Who makes the decision? How is it managed? Does it need to be a calibrated gauge that's on there to tell us what the temperature is? And making sure that we've set this criteria and making sure the criteria is understood by the relevant people working on that particular operation. And it's making sure that we have a process in place to make sure that all our operations and facilities, equipment, anything that's using energy is working the way they're supposed to do. To make sure that we control planned changes. If we're going to change something, how do we take energy efficiency into that? And if things happen that are unintended, if there's unintended changes, things that we weren't expecting, again, how do we react to that from an energy perspective? The standard mentions outsourced SEUs, outsourced energy users, but actually I've yet to come across that. So it's not something I'm going to talk about. If you have any issues with outsourced SEUs from an energy perspective, come back and talk to me about it, because it's something I've not really come across. I've come across it in environment, but not really in energy. These clauses are just the same as the old standard. If we are designing a new process, if we're designing a new way of working within the business, if we're updating our facilities, equipment, we need to think about making sure that what we're doing has energy efficiency at the heart of it. So if we're going to upgrade things, we need to make sure we're upgrading to something that hopefully is going to help improve our energy performance. And these two clauses go together because we also need to make sure that whatever we're buying as part of that design is going to operate in an energy efficient way. And one of the key mandatory requirements is if you are going out to tender to buy something and that something is going to use a significant amount of energy, you have to inform suppliers that energy performance will be one of the evaluation criteria. That is something that's mandatory. You don't have an option. And if I'm auditing and I walk into a business and see a big new flashy machine, or somebody's got a whole new fleet of vehicles, one of the things I will ask and I will expect to see is how that requirement was built into the tender process. So when you're tendering, when you're going out to buy things, making sure that energy performance is specified, that also includes the purchase of energy. We look at how energy is purchased as well. Not the price, but in terms of how energy is actually procured, the type of contracts that you're on, etc., etc. The final two clauses are not too dissimilar again. So performance evaluation, how are we going to monitor the energy we're using? What methods are we going to use to ensure we've got valid results? So again, are we using calibrated equipment? How do we take readings? Are we taking manual readings? Are we working off our electricity bills? Do we have what are called AMR readers, automatic meter readings? Can we download it from a website somewhere? What criteria do we use to take measurements, and what are the indicators we need to use? How are we going to perform the monitoring? What time of the day do we do it? What is it done at the end of the week? Is it done on a Monday morning? When are we going to analyze the results, and then making sure that we communicate those results both internally and externally as required? This always makes me smile that there is a clause on evaluation compliance, yet there isn't a clause on legislative compliance per se. But there are, in all nationalities, in all parts of the world, there are specific pieces of energy legislation that we have to comply with. And as a business, we need to make sure that we are doing what we're meant to be doing from a legislative perspective. So it's just the same as 14,001 would require. We need to work out how we're going to evaluate this conformity, when are we going to do it, how often are we going to do it, and there's a variety of methods. It doesn't just have to be an audit. We could do a documentation review, could be a site walk around, day-to-day monitoring, people walking around with their eyes open, all sorts of things. So again, it's a very, very similar process to what's already been done previously. Internal audit hasn't changed at all. If you understand internal audit in 9, 14, 45, the old standards 50,001, just the same. Have an audit program. How often are we going to audit? What's the method? Who's responsible? How are we going to plan to do the audits? The standard still requires process auditing. So if you've got an integrated system, this morning I ran a session with a load of our consultants on integrated management systems. Process auditing to me states, if we take let's take the heat treatment oven as an example, a process audit of that heat treatment oven would look at the quality side of it. So in other words, how do you control the output from the oven in terms of is it achieving what it's meant to achieve? How are you doing it from a safety perspective? How are you doing it from an environmental perspective, and also from an energy efficiency perspective? You're looking at all of those different aspects in the one process, rather than saying, I'm going to come and see you this week to talk about energy, I'll be back next week to look at health and safety. So think about auditing a process rather than auditing a system or the standard. Management review, again, helpfully I've put the inputs and outputs. Remember, it's a process. I still see people refer to the management review meeting. You don't see that word meeting in the standard anywhere. It is a process, and some of the most effective management reviews I've audited don't involve a meeting. It's a management review report that's circulated. People have a chance to discuss it, have a chance to feed into it, and then a review output is produced, but it doesn't necessarily have a meeting. And then finally, improvement. The standard requires that we improve, and the thing that has caused the biggest bone of contention with this standard is this requirement for continual improvement. Now, that slide just talks a little bit about the non-conformity and corrective action, which is no different to the other standards. I'm not going to go into details on 50,003. 50,003 is an associated standard to 50,001 that applies to us. It applies to us as a certification body, but it tells us, it sort of builds on, for those of you that are involved in certification, it builds on 17021. And basically what it did when it was produced in, I think it was 2014, it brought out a new definition. And it said that this term energy performance improvement, if it wasn't achieved, became an automatic major non-conformity, and that has caused a little bit of an issue. So failure to demonstrate continual improvement in energy performance is a major non-conformance. That wasn't in the old standard, but it is in the new standard. Clause 10.2 specifically states there shall be continual improvement in energy performance, and that's not always easy to achieve. As an aside, and I think we might run another session on this at some point, there is a new version of 50003 just being launched. It's watered down that requirement ever so slightly to say that the demonstration of energy performance improvement only now has to be done at a recertification visit. So the two intermediate surveillance visits don't look at energy performance improvement. That's been produced and that's been issued now, but at the moment it's still out for comment for the next 60 days. I think those 60 days start from today. So we're right at the cutting edge today of where this is going, but at the moment, this standard requires continual improvement in energy performance year on year. So, as I say, that's about all I wanted to say on that subject. I'm happy to engage anybody that wishes to talk to me one-to-one about that issue. So the transition process, just to recap, we've got 3 minutes left, so I think we've timed it perfectly. Still not had any questions. This is your last chance for questions if you've got any. Or somebody's typed something in the question box, not the chat box. That's interesting. Somebody's just put generator question mark. I'm not quite sure what that means, whether you want to know what a generator is or what, I'm not so sure. But anyway, I can't really answer that. Generator question mark. If there's a supplementary question, ask it quick. So the transition process. It's been deemed that the changes to the standard are significant. NQA are in the business of performing value-added assessments. So it's not just a tick box exercise. All 50,001 2011 certificates will expire automatically on the 31st of January 2022. And if a business hasn't transitioned by then, you'll wake up on the 1st of February and you won't have 50,001. The transition can be done in 3 ways. It can be done at a reassessment. That's how we recommend it. It can be done at a surveillance, and it can be done as a special anytime visit. We can do pre-assessments. I've done a couple where people have said it's a little bit like sort of taking your car for a check before it has to have its MOT test. So I've gone in and just had a look at a number of systems that have been brought into line and spent a little bit of time giving them a bit of a pre-assessment. It doesn't have a formal bearing on the certification process, doesn't count towards the assessment time, isn't part of the assessment, but it gives you that sort of reassurance that you're on the right lines. If you want to do that, speak to me, speak to NQA Sales. So the transition process is the same as all the other transitions that we've done. Your assessor will contact you 30 days or so, about a month before the audit. There is a formal document, a transition gap analysis. It's form TR006 for those of you that are within NQA, but your assessor will send it to you and it's supplied. It asks you to go through and document all of the changes that you've made and how you've changed them. It signposts it and it needs to be presented at the opening meeting. We need to see that an internal audit has been carried out against the new standard, but it could be limited to just a gap analysis. That's fine. But there must have been a management review against the requirements of the new standard. So a summary of the 2018 standard. It's adopted the Annex SL structure. It's slightly clarified or better clarified what an energy review is. There's some additional guidance in there now on normalizing performance indicators and the associated EMBs, that's the energy baseline. Some clarification on the energy data collection plan. So there's a bit more in there about planning to collect data. And as I say, the text around performance indicators and baselines have been clarified. And there we go. Reminder, 31st of January 2022. What happens next? Take another look at your system, look at our website. There's tons of information on our website. I've produced all sorts of different materials. Look at the key changes, identify those as an opportunity for improvement, update your documentation, make sure it reflects the new structure, make sure that you've got the requirements on leadership, risk and context in there. Look at your current controls, assume that every control has to be improved, and then carry out the gap analysis, and there we go. Couple of adverts at the end, bit of training that we can do, and again, something if you speak to NQA, there's training around all of this, and that's it. And I'm going to have to dash because I've gone over by exactly 1 minute, and I'm going to be late for our managing director's afternoon briefing, which I have to attend this afternoon. So thank you very much for your attendance. I've obviously fulfilled everybody's needs because there aren't any questions. Somebody said thank you, very useful. Thank you, I appreciate that. Remember, richard.walsh@nqa.com if you have any questions outside of this. I thank you all for your attendance. Have a good weekend. It's Friday afternoon here, it's 3 o'clock. I'm going to watch this and then that's me done for the week. So thanks a lot, and I'll catch up with you all again sometime in the future.